The Mexican-American War started with a thirst for land, expansion, money, and to gain power. To gain political power, the Southerners wanted more states to support slavery within Congress. In doing so, the Americans crossed paths with the Mexicans.
In this time period, Congress is trying to avoid dealing with slavery and focusing on other subjects, such as conspiracies on Britain and how they may try to block off the Americans' territorial growth. But the Mexican-American War ignited the debate on slavery, essentially forcing Congress to bring up the subject on slavery. Although Congress puts off the topic of slavery, America is still divided, where there are many arguments on whether slavery should be legal. The people either wanted slavery or they did not want slavery, and the two sides were separated in North versus South. Northern states had major ports and could trade without the need of slaves, but the South had fertile land, good for crop, which slaves powered the agriculture. It is March 8, 1846. 2,500 men are divided into 3 brigades. Departing from known today as Corpus Christi, Texas, Colonel David E. Twiggs leads 7 dragoons and a battery of light artillery, then followed by 3 infantry brigades and a day's interval between the orders. The last brigade was moved from Corpus Christi on the 11th of March, with a guard left behind to secure the camp. After many days of march, the Americans reached the Rio Grande, where they set a camp. The Mexicans were angered at the approach of the Americans, where men of the 4th Infantry were killed west of Fort Brown. This was the start of the conflict. The war ended with the Battle for Mexico City. The Americans stormed the heavily secured city, taking fire in the siege, but were able to take the city, forcing all Mexican infantry to surrender. After the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848, where the Mexicans pulled back all their forces and the boundary lines of territory were set. The treaty added a great 525,000 square miles to the U.S., and Mexico had to give all claims to Texas, and the Rio Grande was set as the U.S. southern boundary. In return, the U.S. had to pay $15 million to Mexico to settle the claims of the citizens in the U.S.
The Mexican-American War was the main impetus and turning point for the abolition of slavery in the United States. After winning a vast territory in the West after the long conflict with Mexico, the Compromise of 1850 was created. The compromise benefited the slave states at first, but it ultimately led to the abolition of slavery. After the war, there was much debate on whether the new territories of the U.S. would be slave states or free states. On January 29, 1850, the Compromise of 1850, which Senator Henry Clay introduced, was enacted. It consisted of 5 separate laws. Each law had an impact on the North and the South in the debate of slavery. The 5 laws in the Compromise of 1850 had benefits for the North and the South. Almost all of the 5 laws had trade-offs so that the laws would be fair. The first law was that California was able to join the North as a free state. The second law was that the New Mexico and Utah territories would use popular sovereignty to decide whether or not slavery was legal. In other words, the people of these territories choose if slavery is legal within the territories. The third law was that the Republic of Texas had to give up its land claims in present-day New Mexico and also receive $10 million in order to pay off their own debt to Mexico. The fourth law was that the slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia, located in modern Washington, D.C. Although the slave trade was abolished, slavery was still allowed. The fifth and most gruesome law toward the North was the Fugitive Slave Law. This law was the main step toward the Civil War and new disputes about slavery. The part of the Fugitive Slave Law that made it have the description of gruesome in the North was because it required the Northern citizens to aid in the capture of runaway slaves in the North. Many of these Northern citizens were helping in the Underground Railroad, which is why it was torturous work. They had to capture and enslave the very slaves that they were trying to save. The Fugitive Slave Law focused so much on capturing runaway slaves that plantation owners started kidnapping free slaves in the North.
If a free black is being accused of a runaway slave, the black could not stand up for him or herself or call for a trial. This is because blacks at the time were not put in high priority and importance like whites at the time. Their freedom was basically compromised and unstable.
The first short-term impact of the Mexican-American War was the impact of expansion. The victory in the war granted enough land for the United States to double its size with the new territories.
The new territories created questions about whether the new states would be a part of the North or the South in the slavery debate. The problem was presented to Congress and ended up in the Compromise of 1850. A short-term impact was the amount of money that America had achieved with all the victories in the Mexican-American War. If America had not achieved so many victories and so much land, then the amount of money that belonged to America shortly after the war would be drastically different than what really happened. For soon after the Mexican-American War, gold was discovered in California. The land that used to belong to Mexico was now taken of its riches by America. It drastically boosted the economy. The gold discoveries were also an impetus for America's involvement in the building of the Panama Canal. The final and most important short-term impact of the Mexican-American War was the intra-Civil Civil War. The Treaty of Guadalupe allowed for the land including California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada to all be part of the U.S. After those territories were part of the U.S., there was a debate on whether those states should be slave states, and it changed the topic in Congress at that time. Without the Mexican-American War, the Civil War would not have happened, thus influencing the abolition of slavery even greater. Without this revolution, America today would be in chains, where many of us would be slaves.
The main message for Next Steps presented is that you should confront a problem early on and not put it into a shell and try to hide it. If the problem of slavery was dealt with before the Mexican-American War, then the build-up to the Civil War might have never taken place.